Hello and welcome to Shaman Sister Sessions, episode 39, where we are speaking about ancestry and joined by our dear sister, Toni Reynolds. I am Michelle Hawk. I'm here with Catherine Bird, and this is Shaman Sister Sessions. Our podcast was born out of mine and Kat's conversations over the years that we've known each other about shamanism, about spirituality, about what it means to be a practitioner in the world, and what it means to claim our spiritual practice on the personal levels and how that impacts society at large. Today, joined by Toni, I am so excited. Toni and I have been nerding out like crazy over the last few days. She's visiting in town from Baltimore. And just to tell you a little bit about Toni, she is a spiritual scholar and devotee of truth, currently under some investigation as to exactly what the expression of that is. And yet she is a practitioner of Jesus' teachings. She promotes the personal and community-wide expression of the authentic spiritual nature of humanity. She's doing some really amazing work in the world, she's traveled all over the world, promoting spiritual empowerment, promoting investigation of these practices. She is an advocate of sovereignty and freedom for all beings, and she uses her platform as a speaker and a teacher to uplift and inspire her community to live the fullest expression of their divine nature. So please join me in welcoming Toni.
Oh my
Yay!
God. Toni, thank you so much for being here. I'm so happy that you're here. I know pretty much one of Michelle's all-time favorite things is just to sit and talk like with super spiritual, intelligent people and to go deep on lots of topics. I'm sure that you two have had an amazing, it's been a while, it's been a few days, so I'm sure you've had an amazing time together.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you both for inviting me to join you in this conversation. I'm equally excited to nerd out about these kinds of things with people. So
Mm-hmm.
it's good to be here with y'all.
Mm-hmm. To give you a little bit of context, Toni and I met originally at Embrace Festival,
Yeah.
which was back in May, the beginning of May,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that was the conference that we had our other sister Deshna Ubeda on as a guest several months ago to speak about the conference and about what was it? Sacred community and social transformation. Yes.
She
Okay.
paid us to say that. No, I'm kidding.
Stay tuned next year for Embrace 2018. We just had lunch with her yesterday, so it's fresh on our minds.
Right.
But Toni and I met at that conference where we were both speaking, and I was so struck by not only by Toni's talk that she was giving on ancestry, actually, but also by her presence and we've stayed in touch over the last few months. And she came out for a few days to visit, so it's wonderful to have her here.
Mm-hmm. Good to be here.
Yeah.
That's so exciting. So we have, we have a pretty big topic, and it's a very big topic, and one that I think that, a lot of people are interested in. We're seeing a lot of interest in ancestry and people doing, I know my mom is always calling me with the latest like ancestry information that she's gotten off the internet about my family. And people are having access to things that we didn't really necessarily have access to before. And we're doing DNA testing to find out where we came from, and we're doing all of this sort of individualized inquiry within ourselves through our lineage, our blood relative DNA lines. And then we see a lot of us in the spiritual communities having these seeking into different, maybe the same lineages that we're coming from through our blood, but then also other lineages that we're researching and studying and learning about, because we feel like we have a soul connection to specific ancestries. And we're doing ancestral healing and being called to do a lot of healing for our ancestors as a collective and individually. So there's so much more than even just that. Like there's so much to this topic. So I think it's going to be up to us to try to rein it in a little bit and see like what are the pieces that are of great importance. I would love to hear a little bit about your story of maybe your ancestry and how this has become something that you've been really diving into and focused on in your personal and spiritual practices.
Sure. Yeah, it's certainly a really wide topic that can go in a lot of directions. I am not one of those folks who's gone the route of doing the DNA tests for my ancestral, a part of the ancestral truth. I think for me, it's began with being born to an interracial couple. So my mother is a white woman from the north in Maryland, and my father's a black man from down south in Alabama. And they each have pieces of their own family ancestral stories. And so when they come together, and me and my sisters, we have our own set of questions about how far back can we go? What kinds of things can we know? What kinds of things will remain a mystery? And recognizing that there's some shared ancestry to the Cherokee tribe. They both have some grandparents and great grandparents. And so that began a world of inquiry for me. And then I went to seminary where I studied New Testament scholarship, mostly live in the world of scripture that didn't make it into the Bible, particularly the Nag Hammadi collection that was found in Egypt in the 1940s. And in there, sort of unlocked the set of questions about sort of faith ancestry. And here we have this whole corpus of scripture that never made it into the mainstream versions of the Christianity that's practiced often in the United States today. And so I felt like there are these pieces of our faith ancestry that didn't make it all the way over here. And that feels like an important place to play, to think about what new questions can we ask about who we are, about what the ancient world was like, what kinds of things made their way through the timeline, and what things didn't, and why, what that teaches us about blockages, the importance of process and coming back around to certain messages, on and on. And then a third component of this constellation for me has been activity in my dream life. And I had a visit from Yemaya, who is an Orisha. An Orisha is, for if folks don't know, kind of a deity of the Yoruba tradition, which is a tribe from Nigeria. And so the Yoruba tradition was brought to this side of the world on slave ships during the transatlantic slave trade. So not by will, certainly. And the traditions has taken on different forms throughout the Americas, from north to south, central to south, all of those places in between, and kind of manifested differently as the development of the colonial era made its impact on the African folks who were enslaved. And so I had no idea who Yemaya was until I had her in a dream. And then I saw her in a shop window, and I went in, and this whole thing began to unfold for me on a level I'd never really considered. I don't think I'd ever thought about a spiritual ancestry at that capacity, sort of like entities being able to visit and ask these things of us. And so for some folks, that's old news, but for me at the time, that was very new. And then because I don't have the full story of who I come from, I didn't know what to do with it, and I'm still playing around with the best ways to honor this presence and this tradition that's come to me in a really surprising way. So those three constellations: a sort of social, contextual, familial way, general faith ancestry, and then sort of spiritual, as you were alluding to, Catherine, of like the places where we're connected but maybe don't understand the direct genetic link to. So
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for kind of outlining that that constellation for us. I love that word too, because that's really how, whenever we're looking into ancestry, Kat, as you were mentioning a couple of minutes ago, you're talking about not only the genetic ancestry and where that comes from, but also, you know, Toni, as you mentioned, the faith ancestry, and then also what are we being smacked over the head with by spirit that we, you know, and then there's this whole other the whole other cultural appropriation topic, which is another episode in itself that we've talked about bits and pieces of here and there, where a lot of people have a lot of hangups and a lot of, justifiably a lot of uncertainty around stepping into claiming whatever lineages want to be coming through as directed by spirit, because it might be in conflict with the social justice and the social sociopolitical, and also the climate of appropriate behavior as relating to other traditions. So this is definitely a really rich topic. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's super fascinating, and what an amazing, beautiful journey that you've had. We do have one quick question about the women disciples. Are those part of the missing pieces of the Bible? And there's a big yes there. So very much so, right? That in your study we are missing, right? We're missing a lot of, and then also when you look at Africans being brought over, and how much tradition was lost. One of the things I've been doing some study into this tradition, because the ceremonies that I attend have a Umbanda aspect, and Umbanda is sort of the piece that came from Brazil, to the Afro-Brazilian tradition, and that it was interesting that some of these traditions were actually kept alive because Catholicism had all the saints and the different correspondences that the African traditions could kind of weave themselves into and sort of hide within. And in different Protestant countries and places, it wasn't as likely that those traditions survived. So it's really fascinating that we, as this melting pot of culture, have so many different traditions feeding into us. And then also, as Americans, there is also in some ways a generalized sense of lack of identity in a lot of ways, that we don't, a lot of us don't feel, and that maybe we have as strong a connection to our lineages and our ancestry, either maybe because they were stolen from us in the cases of our native people or Africans and different people who were brought here as indentured servants and so on, or because our ancestors sought assimilation, and because that was what was safe, because that's how they could make money, that they completely left behind a lot of their traditions, religious and otherwise.
Yeah, I want to say just a small bit about that question of women discipleship, just more directly. Yeah. So one of the most compelling portions in regard to the ancestral conversation is the story of the Acts of Paul and Thecla. So Thecla was a young woman, saint. Now she's a saint. At the time, she was a regular young woman who was promised to be married. And so the story goes that Paul the Apostle, who we hear about in the Acts, that's in the Protestant and Catholic Bible both, he was teaching as disciples do, and Thecla heard his teachings from the window of her house and was so entranced that the story says that she was in like catatonic state because she was so entranced with this message. And so she confronts all of these different arranged marriages and things that women ought to do, and she rejects them several times and escapes death several times, and ended up finishing her life with this really incredible healing ministry. And her story was so important that there are still churches that venerate Thecla. So in modern day Turkey, which is in a really tumultuous area, so like war zones, lots of violent conflict, there are cathedrals and entire communities that have remembered her, but many folks here in the United States have never heard of Thecla. And so just in one beautiful example, this woman who not justifies the sort of dogmatic understandings that women can't be in leadership positions in many of the Judeo-Christian pockets, Thecla, not only as a woman, denying these societal expectations of women, but she also baptizes herself and claims her divine authority as a woman of God and a healer in the world. And so, in terms of legacy and ancestry, like that's one example that you can see just in the brief summary how that story is a bit threatening to the controlling nature that many of us have been wounded by, if we were born into families that practice some version of a limited Christian understanding of the role of women. So yeah, the women discipleships are a great example of a story lost but being resurrected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. Thank you. Yeah, let's delve a little bit into, some of these different pieces of the constellation, right? Because, and this is true for all of us here. So, we'll be sharing some of our stories and investigations. But so, like, the first one that you mentioned is the like the social aspect of ancestry. And so all of us, whether or not you've had the DNA testing or had gone through ancestry.com, I haven't done either of those things because frankly, it kind of skeezes me out a little bit. I'm like, no, you don't get to have my DNA. Yeah, no, thank you, government.
I feel weird about that. Like, what are you doing with it after you?
Exactly, right? So, yeah, I have all sorts of so the best I have in terms of defined knowledge around that is stories from my parents around their ancestry. And then also I have an uncle who is very into looking at the, mapping the lineage. So he was able to map, and this is on my mother's side of the family, he was able to map my mother's side of the family for, back to, I don't even know how far. So he likes that kind of stuff. He did some research around it. So I've been able to look at some interesting patterns and then also some gray areas in at least that one half of my personal ancestry. And I'm kind of curious, what, and I know that that's kind of brought up some stuff for me about like, ooh, yeah, there's some really icky stuff in there. Like I know those people came over with, not necessarily the best of intentions, and then also looking at the different history of different climates of what was going on in the time, and the depression more recently, and yeah, so I'm kind of curious what has come out of that investigation for you on the social front.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, the first thing that comes to mind is a warning to not romanticize an exploration of our ancestral realities. I think for many of us, it's easy to be of a mindset where we only want what's great and fantastic about our stories, and of course we want to celebrate the beautiful things that have been lost. But there's some wisdom to be gleaned from reckoning with the fact that our ancestors had flesh and lived human lives, and maybe were stubborn or mean or greedy or whatever kinds of things humans can be. Like all of these things are true.
Violent,
yeah. And so there's a real way that, depending on maybe the entry one takes into exploring their ancestral realities, that those kinds of things come up. And I think it's important to just say that those are valuable tools for coming to an understanding and for doing the work of finishing the desires of our ancestors in a healthy way that benefits everyone, despite any shortcomings that may have existed for them when they walked with us. I think for me, the gray areas are really fun and frustrating. I find myself really leaning on spiritual tools to explore those areas. It's very easy for me to feel angry, and I don't want to harbor bitterness, but I mean, I really feel a way about the fact that in two ways, there are two different groups of people who just on this land have been robbed of roots, of language, of song, of full life. And some days that resonates more powerfully in my bones and can make it a real challenge in my interactions with real people. And so in my own explorations, I think having a spiritual practice that's rooted in a very particular set of values, and an actual practice of having people who can help hold me when I'm not in the spiritual spaces of prayer or whatever exploration, is really helpful. Was there something else you were? I don't know if I answered your question in a way that's
Sure.
what you had on your heart or
Oh,
something.
no, that's okay. I
Okay.
mean, I like stories, and this is one of the things that I know Kat and I are storytellers, definitely. So yeah, Kat, how about you?
Oh gosh, I have had some really interesting. My mother has gotten really interested in, you know, the ancestry and stuff, and so she's been doing lots of research over the last couple of years on my, you know, on the ground ancestry, and it's brought up a lot of things actually that I've then been able to bring into ceremonial experiences and to healing sessions to be able to actually heal and work on for myself, where I can feel that I'm still holding some of these old belief systems and patterns and judgments and even punishments that are being held within my lineage. I have a couple of interesting stories. So my people have been here for a long time on three sides of my family, both sides of my mother's and the one side of my father. They've been here since the 15 and 1600s. So they were early adopters of the American way and sort of warrior people. Like in every war, my people were there fighting. They didn't really care, I think, even who they were fighting for. They were just fighters. And you know, won accommodations with General Washington, and were just scrappers, and like, okay, let's go west and see what we can take, and like, you know, just it's, you know, some of that stuff was really hard to really come to terms with where they were and who they were. And I have a dear friend, I'm sure she won't mind me telling this story, but I have a dear friend who actually was a client, and we worked on a lot on her reopening her magic. She came to me and was like, she opened up her magic through our work together. And she had called me a while back and said, hey, I found out this cool thing about my ancestry. I'm not sure if it's that cool, but my ancestor was the first witch who was killed in Salem. And I was like, that makes a lot of sense. And then a few months down the road, my mom messages me and is like, you know, we had these ancestors in Salem, Massachusetts around the time of the witch trials. And I was like, that's interesting. And then she actually finds recently, a few months ago, that she found these court documents where the two sisters had actually accused and signed testimony against the first witch who was killed in Salem. And so this month I took some time off, and one of the things that I did in my time off was actually I drove to my friends and we went to the Redwood Forest together. She had no idea what we were doing there, but I was like, I need to do something with you. And we opened up a ceremonial space and did a healing and forgiveness ceremony for our lineages, to ask for forgiveness for this, you know, this wrong, and to open up any energies that have been held and contained because of that, of that thing that had happened. And had a powerful ceremony, and it was very powerful and super profound. And it I think goes to show in some ways how we are drawn into experiences with each other that maybe we don't really know the full story and depth behind what the, you know, what the weaving is for our relationships that we have with each other. And you know, she shared with me about how much that I had, you know, changed her life in allowing her to be magic and allowing her to open up her magical, mystical, witchy self. And that I was often this sort of lighthouse that when she felt like, okay, things aren't you know, maybe things are feeling a little bit stuffy, she'd be like, well, Kat's out there doing this magic, like I can be magic too. And you know, it's I was like, okay, that's a fascinating story, that we would come across each other in Los Angeles, California, hundreds of years later, in order to be able to have that experience together and to go through a healing process together, which is my recent story of something that just happened.
Wow.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Wow.
Right. You're bringing up a really important point, Kat, is about the healing of the lineages and the healing of the and our relationship with the ancestors. So as we're Toni, one of the words that I've noticed you using a lot over the last few days is reckoning. And I love it. I love it. We have to reckon with whatever it is that, rather than beating ourselves up. There's that tendency too. Like when we find these things out, it's like, oh my gosh, I must atone for my ancestors.
Yeah. And I mean, that story you just told, Kat, illustrates that so beautifully. And actually what I'm hearing the voice of a friend from some time ago say, like, the world of the ancestors is in our hands. And equally, I feel like we are in their palms the same, that you two meeting each other is also the work of the ancestors who are present in that moment of conflict. So bringing things back to a place where it can be redeemed and brought to a right relationship of sorts. Yeah, that's, I think, I wonder about this a lot. We've been having conversations about the current political climate and the reality of race tensions in this country, not just like Black to white, but everyone to everyone. Like ethnic and racial identity is a really potent force right now. And I wonder about this in relationship to a lot of white guilt, and this feeling that people who are walking now are directly responsible for these old wounds that are still, there's a lot of residual of them. And so that's part of why for me this conversation is so important, that there's a way to make enough space for people to recognize that we're not the ones making the wounds, but we do have a role to play in acknowledging and making things right, righter. And so whatever kind of gestures we can offer to do that is important for this. Where's our responsibility and where is it not? And how do we line ourselves up with things and hold it all together?
Yeah. And as someone, I was raised in Texas. My mother's a social worker, was very liberal, and there was a certain amount of white guilt, especially my mom holds a lot of guilt around, what white people have done. And so she was always very, very vocal about social justice stuff and really letting me know what was right and what was wrong in Texas, where what was wrong was often what was typical. And coming back to like the story I just told, we're seeing all of this stuff coming together, but how much of this rising up of racial tension are our ancestors actually saying, you actually haven't dealt with this. You haven't actually done the work. We're going to bring you together to do this work. You have an opportunity to do this work of healing and forgiveness and, honoring and everything that needs to happen in order for us to move forward as a society on the right foot. And maybe we're not seeing it clearly enough to be able to navigate it in a way that is as helpful as it should be. But we're kind of like being thrown together one more time, like, okay, just like we really have to figure this out and deal with it. We can't just pretend that it doesn't exist, like I think that we have been in recent years. Like, we'll just act like it's not there.
Yeah. We did an episode a little while ago about soul contracts and agreements. And I don't remember which one that was specifically, but for those of you watching and listening in, you may want to go back and tune in about that, because we did talk about now is a time, and this is something that Toni and I have also spoken about a couple of times over the last few days. Now is a time that we have more energy coming to the planet than ever before. more light workers embodied on the planet than ever before, more people who are coming in with awakening to their gifts than ever before. So the potential for that healing, it's like there's this quantum level of energy that is now present to enable that kind of healing, to enable not only the personal healing and like, okay, so me and my stuff, and from person to person, and whatever interrelational stuff like on the micro level, but on the macro level too. So now is it makes so much sense to me in so many ways that it's like the bubbling to the surface, right? It's the wound is pussing up to be popped. Yeah, and because there is so much energy available, and I love the the perspective, like you were saying, about being held in the palm of the hand of the ancestors, of like, okay, we're holding you, like, they don't want to hold on to these contracts anymore either, right? It's like nobody wins when we're holding on to these contracts of
Amen.
violence.
Amen.
Right. And so we are supported, we are really supported. And so then you're talking about the white guilt aspect. And we were talking, when we had lunch with Deshna yesterday, we were talking about, this relating to minorities in all ways, and the sexual identity spectrum, and et cetera, et cetera. It's all related. And how there's that place of like, okay, then we move beyond that to the actual, like, how can we be constructive in the healing and supporting and empowerment of all beings? And that's where we're getting there. We're getting there.
Because we're held by the ancestors, and then we also have free will, right? So we get to be, here's your situation, it's super uncomfortable, and now what are you gonna do? We did what we did, and this is where we were. Now you guys have more choices.
Yeah. That's I'm curious also to delve into the how this is informing, especially the investigation of these ancestral practices that may have been partially lost or partially concealed or assimilated or or hidden, right? And how is that coming forward, and how can we strengthen that connection with the ancestors in a really healthy way to empower ourselves and empower the people around us and empower the traditions themselves, while also helping keep it relevant to the modern context that we live in?
So I'm feeling a lot of Ellen Craft is a woman whose story is not told very often, and so I'm always thinking about things in the social sphere, and I know you all are too, but immediately I'm like, oh, this is a great example of that. Exactly. So Ellen Craft was a woman born to an enslaved mother who was raped by her slave owner. So she was very fair complected, and she passed for white, so much so that the slave master's wife sold her off because she was sick and tired of people recognizing her and thinking she was a member of the family when she was really just a Negro slave. And so Ellen ended up marrying an enslaved man as well, who was not fair complected, like he was visibly, obviously an enslaved man. And they escaped to freedom by Ellen dressing up like she had dental surgery and cutting her hair short, and she wrapped her arm in a sling. And so she needed her husband to do all of her bidding. So she posed as the slave owner and he as her slave. And they escaped from Georgia all the way up to Boston, and they became this poster story for the abolitionist movement, and this simultaneously fueled the pro-slavery agenda, say like, this Negro woman fooled all of these people for thousands of miles. No one knew that she was really a Negro woman, but she took on the role of white slave master and rode them both to freedom. And that story is an example, like telling that she's very much asking a lot of me. And one of the things that I think she's asking to do exactly what you said is to tell the stories, to get the information out. I think what's powerful about stories is that they hit us on all of the levels at the same time. And so there are things that we can end up doing with them in our individual practices or in collective spaces. And so, for example, for me as a Black mixed woman, this story of a mixed race woman way back when in our history having this really phenomenal moment that challenges race, that challenges gender, that challenges notions of enslavement is a really incredible symbol of that I like. I want to wear that power and find
Mm-hmm.
compassionate ways to employ that in the world. And so in terms of spiritual practice, there are things, but also societally, in terms of remembering history in very real ways.
Mm.
There's a lot of Facebook videos about in this movement of just tearing down the Confederate monuments of folks who owned, I mean, like all kinds of stories that just haven't been told about the reality of different groups of people that get hard to fit into our history books, as they seem to be getting narrower and narrower in story. So one, I think that's one way. Like if there's a historical preference that one has,
Mm-hmm.
or societal uh, like a platform like we were speaking about earlier, if it's animals, if it's young girls, if it's education, like those are pulls for a reason, and those are ways to line up the spiritual call to the societal level to instigate this movement, so that it manifests on more than one level.
I think that's, yeah, it's a beautiful story, and it's, how do we actually relate to one another, right? Is that, through these stories, and I think you're right that there have been, because of the tensions and the monuments and these different things, there have been a lot of stories that have been, told recently that unless you went to a university and you took a specific course where you were getting this kind of information, you are definitely have not had access to it, and unless you've done really gone out of your way to learn this stuff, because it's not what's being taught in our school systems in America. We are seeing less and less of kind of a real history being taught, and it is up to us, right, to tell these stories. And the stories that, I've been seeing a lot of stories about, just the, the atrocities that we as the American government or American people have subjugated onto different races and people, and our native people of this country, that we didn't even have access to those stories really for such a long time.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot that is certainly swept under the rug. I want to mention Germany, for example, because I think this is and specifically what they've done over the last, couple of decades around education of the young people in regards to the Holocaust. I think this is perhaps slightly a bit far in the other direction, because I know personally, and then I know also of other people who, people our age who were educated from a very young age about the Holocaust in a super shaming way, like super shamey. It's like, never do this again. We were evil and this was horrible and, bad, 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 to the point where this is the strongest example. I don't have it as a firsthand story, but a friend of mine told me this story of the most extreme example of internalizing that guilt that I've heard, where so my friend went on a birthright trip to Israel, and so she was exploring her roots in Judaism, and speaking with doing a lot of religious investigation and personal investigation, and study group of scripture, etc. And so in this particular group, she happened to meet someone traveling who was a German woman about our age, who was just happened to be traveling through Israel. And they invited her, they hit it off. So they invited her to this study group just as a point of personal investigation. And this young woman was, and it was just a very open, non-judgmental conversation that happened to include, because of what they happen to be studying that time, around the suffering of the Jewish people. And of course, somebody brought up the Holocaust, and it's like a very open, like comfortable environment. And yet this woman was in tears, shaking violently in this room of gently conversing people, talking about a historical event with not really any emotional charge. And yet from a very young age, she had been so fiercely educated with shame about this is the wrong thing to do. So I think somewhere in between those might be the ideal way to be really telling the stories of our ancestors in an empowering way, as opposed to bad people.
I heard a podcast too of folks who were sterilizing themselves because they were worried that the genes of the Nazi soldiers would potentially carry on and be an impetus for a second type of, so even a little further more of like,
Wow.
I don't want my legacy to continue, and just a really firm grip that is one's legacy, to do that kind of wrong and violence to others. So yeah, I mean, I just keep hearing, like earlier in the conversation, in this being held moment, that this is so possible. And I think for me and my work with anti-racism programming, in the ways that I've done it so far, is that it's often a really overwhelming thing that, like, we're never going to get there. It's like we can never end patriarchy, we can never end bills of capitalism, we can never end bills of racism, but it's possible. It's so possible to do, like, these are ideas. In the same way that I might have the idea of lack, that I don't have enough, like, that idea can be shifted. And these ideas that certain folks don't deserve to be fully empowered and free can be shifted. And so there's that is the, like, guiding, that's the fuel. How do we do this in a way that recognizes the capability of this task?
Yeah,
we can do this.
woohoo.
Woohoo.
Yes, I can. Yeah.
So I do want to make sure that we touch a little bit on our spiritual lineages, and how we see all over the place people embracing and diving deeply into study into oh great, because here we just, as she's asking the question, here we go, how do we integrate our spiritual ancestral lineages that we know of into something as socially acceptable? Because this is really coming up for healers and teachers, and there's a fine line, and that's true. And so that's what I want to talk about, is that we see ourselves, like, some of us are very, like white people, okay, I'm Tibetan Buddhism, I'm there, like I am in it 100%, or different people who are studying these different religious traditions, that looking at them, or even looking at their lineage on ancestry.com, you would say, that doesn't make any sense. What are you doing in that sweat lodge? This, you don't have a right to be taking these medicines. You don't have a right to be singing these songs. These are not your songs of your people that you've suffered for these songs. And yet there are many people who express this internal feeling like that song means something to me. Like that ceremony means something to me. I don't know why it means something to me. I can't really quite figure that part out, maybe, but there is something so deep inside of me that I can't turn away from it. I feel like this is my path, and it feels important. And for a lot of sort of in the new age spiritual communities, we see this, and there can be a lot of suffering. Both on the terms of the person who is having that experience of, I really want to engage in this spiritual practice, and then also from the people who more own the lineage through their birthright, suffering over the fact that this person seems like, we've suffered so much, and this person seems like they're just going to show up with all their privilege and be able to take over our thing. So how do we navigate this part of our spiritual lineage? So many of us are in this place. We don't know.
That's a great question.
We're all jumping at once.
We still don't know.
Right. This is something that I think all of us have had some degree of experience with, of like, what is, and we have talked about this somewhat in certain episodes. We haven't really gotten quite to the meat of it there, because I think part of it is that it is an ongoing investigation. And the thing that I keep coming back to, as a relatively simplified version of these hours and hours and hours that I spend thinking about and pondering and praying about, what do I do in this regard, is ultimately summed up by, I know who I am, I know what I am, I know how I serve, and my ultimate accountability is to spirit. So if, and I went through all of this, for example, I mean, Kat, you had a front seat to this a few years ago when I was going through the, do I get to call myself a shaman investigation, where, because that is a loaded term in a lot of ways. People associate with shaman equals Native American, and like, no, it doesn't. First of all, that, very first, that word is something that it was made up by anthropologists. That word itself has no connection really to any specific group of people, and yet, there are these practices that are really similar across many tradition, or I would say many or most traditions and cultures. Is like the earliest spiritual practices, right? So I have since come to terms with it, and yet years ago when I was thinking about this, for example, it was eating me up of like, am I contributing to persecution of particularly the Native people, Native Americans, because that's where a lot of that emotional charge lies. Am I using my privilege in a way that is hurting people? Am I denying somebody something? Am I being out of integrity? So no, 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 I'm not going to call myself a shaman out of this. And it was really fear-based. Ultimately, it was deeply fear-based of, will I cause harm or am I causing harm? And I'm unwilling to do that. And finally, the kicker for me was basically spirit did the equivalent of slapping me in the face and said, look, we're telling you that you're a shaman. Start calling yourself a shaman, start doing it. And once I did, it was really amazing the shifts that took place in my life and my lived experience that very much confirmed for me that it was the right thing to do. And because ultimately I was able to step beyond the fear that I held, the fear for being out of integrity, fear for causing harm, fear for also some personal anxiety about being attacked. Quite frankly, that was there too, of like, are people going to be jumping on me because I'm calling myself a shaman? And oh shit, I don't want to deal with that. And yet it was one of the most powerful things that I've ever done. That's one piece of this, I think, one piece around the ancestry, but that's very much a part of my soul ancestry that involves me claiming that.
Yeah. I think there's also something to say for finding a way to balance those fears that come up. So for me, and I've had this conversation with Michelle since I met you in May, the way that I talk about Yemaya and other Orishas sometimes feels like it feels that same area. I'm not initiated as a priestess in the tradition or any iteration of the tradition, so I feel like I have a boundary, and I'm okay with that boundary. I think one of the things that motivates that concern, that sort of, am I appropriating, is this an integrity, for me points me exactly to what am I not doing with the communities who do have roots in that tradition. So I would feel differently if I had a Yoruba community with whom I could practice and practice my integrity in the flesh with. I would feel then differently about I think I would have much better guidance and certainty about how to navigate the language I use, the way I implement the practices that have been informed by it, even as they've come from Yemaya herself. And so that's one thing, is sort of, if I'm informed by a Native American tradition, am I in community with the particular peoples from whom I draw life and nourishment? If I'm not, what can I be doing to support and ameliorate the suffering that they are inevitably experiencing in a system that's designed to destroy them? And so if there's a way that you can participate in balancing that out, I think that can be helpful for negotiating what things we can and can't say as folks who don't have an obvious connection to the things. Yeah, and the other thing is to be careful about the role we let shame and fear play in this life of figuring those things out. I think what I want to say is that often these things are about witness. So while as informed as I am by traditions that I don't know if I have a genetic tie to, I certainly don't have a cultural tie to, because I was raised by two folks who served in the US Army. So like, our culture was the five of us wherever we went. Like, it was never a powwow despite our Cherokee blood. It was never, anything African despite my dad being an African American man. It was us. And so I think in a lot of ways, some of these spiritual pulls are a request to witness the power, to witness the beauty, to witness the mystery of figuring of the fact that you do feel these connections and have no way to explain it and no way to talk about it. And I think that's okay. Like, there's a lot of power in just seeing a person, seeing a community, seeing a practice as it is, and being able to say to others, this thing gives me life. And I, as someone, and like, name your limits, I named the fact that I'm not an initiate, and so that governs what I am and am not able to say and do. And that kind of authenticity in and of itself, to me, helps right some of the harm that we think might happen if we just show up and start doing a thing. So I think being honest about the limits that we observe in our own work, and also being willing to just sit and do nothing but witness. We don't have to do a lot, just be a witness to the things that show up, that call you, that continue to come to you.
Yeah, that's amazing, beautiful advice. You know, and really so helpful. We're all trying to figure this out, right? And to be in honor and integrity around all of it, which is in some cases is just very challenging.
Mm-hmm. I want to address an important component that I feel is related to all of this is, and something that we've been talking about again. We've had variations of these conversations over the last few days, so we're all supercharged of it, and we're all full of, well, what about this thing? What about this thing? One of the things that it feels, I'm not sure exactly what to do about it, but it feels really important to talk about service to the lineage itself as opposed to service to spirit, right? And this is across the board in any tradition. You know, Toni and I have had this conversation in regards to, for example, classes and be initiated into Reiki 1 and 2. So yay for a new Reiki practitioner right here. Yay. And, Reiki is something that I have been initiated into. I've been studying for years and teaching for years, and yet I'm not Japanese. It's a Japanese tradition. And so the way that I teach it is informed by the way that I was taught. And the way that I was taught was also not by a Japanese person. She was a white American person who taught in a very old school way. Like, she was, very adherent to the way in which Reiki has been taught for, since it came to the Western Hemisphere with Hawayo Takata, and honoring that lineage. But also ultimately, I've been looking at the way that my own personal practice to Reiki has changed, and my relationship with Reiki has changed over the years, because this is the thing that I have the most definitive, grounded connection to a lineage that I have practiced for the longest amount of time. So that's the easiest for me to cotton onto. And I look at, initially when I was attuned to Reiki and I was trained in Reiki in 2006, I remained very adherent to, this is the way that it is done. This is how Reiki came to the United States from Japan directly, brought by Hawayo Takata. And even though she was known for varying her story that she was telling wherever she went to make it acceptable to people, especially during that time, right? Right? Exactly. So, particularly in Eastern tradition, telling the story for the audience rather than the Western understanding of, this is the absolute truth, the empirical truth, is like, truth is a relative term. Truth is a relative thing. So here she was, a Japanese American woman who had to hide among the Filipino community during World War II so she wouldn't be killed in an internment camp, right? And so that's how Reiki survived in the United States. So looking at that lineage that does hold suffering, that holds the energy of that persecution. And I look at, what is my loyalty to that particular lineage, and also what is my loyalty to my service to spirit as a spiritual leader in my community. And as a result of that, of sitting with this for years, I've shifted around a little bit, where yes, I am loyal to Reiki as a practice, and I do still teach Reiki not exactly in the same way that I was taught. And yet I feel completely integrous about it because this particular practice, because I'm acknowledging that to my students of you're not learning Reiki Alliance Reiki. You're not learning the old school version of Reiki. You're learning based on my years and years of doing this every single day and my commitment to my practice. This is the best way that I know how to teach and empower you. Also honoring this lineage and giving dear respect and reverence to this lineage, and ultimately giving you empowerment to claim who you are in your direct relationship service to spirit as a divine embodied being. And that's ultimately what I've come to terms with for myself of how can I be in highest integrity to spirit and to doing my job as a light worker here on earth, while holding on to that, the strength of that lineage and all of that amazing service that that lineage has offered me, and not detracting from it at all.
And actually, you've said this to me sometime this weekend, but it's also, and it has its own set of questions, I'm sure, if you go deeper, but that sounds like an embodiment of what the initial teacher of, not the, how do you say her name? The woman
Hawaii Takata.
Hawaii Takata, and the fact that she would tell the story to the audience is also what you do. And so in a way, you are demonstrating a loyalty to the legacy by doing what she did in the initiation of the practice. And back to the women discipleship thing, in the Gospel of Mary, Jesus has died and the disciples are hiding out because they're coming for this group of folks who are part of the Jesus movement, and they're scared, and they say to Mary, Mary, Jesus loved you best. Surely he gave you special teachings. Tell us what he taught you. And it's a fragmented text that survived, but Mary goes through this teaching, and at the end of it, she remains silent. And if you read the text from like one level above the actual text, you realize that she's embodying the teaching that she's giving while she's giving it. And so she may have altered it for the moment because here they are in a moment of crisis, but regardless of the fact, she has embodied the teaching and put it into flesh. And so there's a way that you can do both at the same time without skewing the teaching for the lineage or the lineage for the teaching.
Yeah, because when we look at amazing teachers, amazing masters of spiritual teaching, you know, they speak in allegory and stories, and things change based on, you know, the inspiration of the moment of the person asking the question as to what the story that's being told to offer the wisdom. And that only comes, I think, through this embodied owning the wisdom. Like, you really have to own the wisdom in order to explain it in 100 different ways, and it's still to ring true for different people. Yeah,
That's a good teacher. Yeah. Go ahead, girl.
Yeah.
I'll help you out. You go ahead.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. I think I also want to I get really fired up about this because it's the evolving nature of our relationship to spiritual practice. That's another thing too, where yes, we're talking about ancestry and we can investigate our ancestry and honor our ancestors, and yet I do also believe that to practice and adhere to the rigidity of certain rituals and certain ways of being, and we can do too much of that. That's my point. It's like, if we're doing it only that way, and we're, you know, there's so much, again, that rigidity, that dogma, that's the word I want to use. It's like, as long as if we're treating it right, I know, if we're looking at it with this dogmatic view of, okay, well, this is the way that you do this tradition, and this is the only way that you do this tradition, then that's paralyzing. It is ultimately paralyzing, for we are a continually evolving society, and, you know, continually changing in our personal way of being, our interrelational way of being, the way that we relate to other people, and the way that we're relating to the planet and to each other as a global community. So I think it is, maybe short-sighted isn't quite the right term. Maybe it is the right term. Yeah.
And inauthentic.
Yeah.
No tradition has ever remained stagnant.
No.
I mean,
our refusal to evolve our spiritual traditions is something that is still getting us into a heap of trouble all over the world. Because if we would allow that books that were written a long time ago, well, maybe we need to maybe look at things a little bit differently based on where the world is now, that women have certain rights, and different cultures and different religions are equal. They're not people that should be, you know, exterminated. Then we would have a much different world and society. And, you know, we're, I guess, on the forefront in a lot of ways of how do we navigate these two pieces of holding on to tradition and what we've learned, and also incorporating what's new and incorporating what's possible. Because we, like you said, we have access to so much more spiritual energy right now. We have access to so many lineages of wisdom from all over the world. We can sit down and learn about every single religion of the entire planet pretty much, and gain all of this knowledge and wisdom, and practice these different modalities. And so we have the ability to shift and evolve very rapidly, but we're not going to if we put the brakes on and go, no, we're not going to allow for any new anything, nothing new here.
Yeah, I think that's where that they certainly don't oppose each other inherently. The investigation of so the genetic ancestry and the spiritual ancestry, and they are in no way opposed to each other, and yet I feel as though there might be a little bit of a tendency to have them mutually exclude each other. So this is where I think we're circling back around to, in investigating the social aspects of the ancestry. Okay, well, as long as I hold on to my ancestors did this horrible thing to this group of people, and did this horrible thing to this particular person, and they were responsible for setting off the Salem witch trials, like, as long as we're holding on to that, then it's it doesn't create space, and maintaining the rigidity of, well, that's the lineage I'm connected to, so, like, peace out, I'm screwed. It's like and yet, of course, there's so much magic in any lineage, but we're really shooting ourselves in the foot if we don't also integrate the the other layers there, the intuitive investigation of how are we working in service to spirit as beings who have been embodied in different ancestries and different lineages. That's the other thing. And right,
we've all been here before. We've all done lots of different lives and lots of different places. We've all suffered, and I know that we all haven't all suffered the same amount in this lifetime, and we have different privilege based on what we look like and where we grew up and how much money we have and all of those things. And still, for most of us that have these, memories, and we have visions, and we have knowings, and, for me, a lot of my work, I didn't have access to these traditions. I didn't have access to these things. I grew up in Texas, suburban. I moved to New York City. I lived in Los Angeles. When I had my spiritual awakening, it was ridiculous because all of this insane stuff was happening to me in my body, and the way that I would do, the healing work would move through me. I had never seen it before. And then, people would be like, why do you, I've had different people throughout time be like, why do you do that thing? Like, why do you do that? Because I've never seen that before, except, in this tribe and, this faraway place that doesn't make any sense. And so I've had to, like, almost reverse engineer to look at, okay, well, these things, and then this person says this, and then, well, this is kind of reminds me of this, and oh, I'm having this memory, or I'm having this dream, I'm having this vision. Okay, when was that? What does it look like? Where does it come from? So what is that tradition? What does that tradition look like? And how is that connected to me? And why do I feel resonance with that? So it's almost like I've been playing a game of like this very bizarre mystery game of clues of trying to figure out what the hell am I? What am I doing? Who am I? Where am I coming from? It doesn't seem to match the story that I'm being told by ancestry.com.
Yeah.
But in some ways it does. There's also stories of midwives and healers and witches in my lineage that are gypsy people and the Roma and stuff like that. So people who did have those traditions, but we're all doing something new somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's after 1 and we went to be good on time. So usually we like to wrap up with some, we've already given some nice tools for people to work with on both, connecting with, if you are connecting to something, really being in community with that culture and finding those, those ways of being in service to those that maybe have been holding this tradition for you. Like they've been holding this tradition for you this whole time. Now you're showing up, you have a connection. Okay, how are you going to honor the people who've been holding it? But how else are we looking to maybe dive into our own ancestral lineages in these different regards, and maybe do some healing work around these things, and be able to step into more of our authentic expression through this ancestral work?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Lots of ways.
Okay, let's
I don't know. I was kind of spinning around a little bit. This is a lot of good, amazing food for thought. I think I want to. It feels really important, first of all, to. Okay, I have to tell another story in order to give context to this.
okay.
This particular piece of advice. I was telling, and Kat, I think I told you about this when it happened because I was so angry about it, and I don't remember if I've told this particular story on our show before, and I did tell Toni about it because it was relevant to a previous discussion. This lecture that I attended back in February. Right, I know.
I'm angry about it too.
Right.
My face might twist as you tell me this story.
That's okay. This lecture that I attended back in February, where it intrigued me, the description of the event. It was, he was going to be speaking about ancestry and about our ancestors and archetypes specifically, and then some other stuff about lineages. And this particular man is a religious scholar, and he also works with helping people explore their genetic ancestry and the spiritual tradition of their genetic ancestry. So I was intrigued, I was curious, and I was like, okay, cool. And I was reading his little bio, and he's it sounded interesting and noteworthy enough. So I went to this lecture, and as he's introducing himself and he's talking, I'm noticing in the room, I was like, wow, I can feel all these deities, all these beings and ancestors that he called in. So I knew he was in the medicine for sure. He was, at least enough so that he could fill the room with all these beings and have it be tangible to me, because I'm very sensitive of that kind of thing. So in my mind, that was a mark of like, okay, he has done work around it. He had a couple of ideas that I really resonated with. I don't need to go into that here. The part that really pissed me off about this particular person is that he was a white man, a very well-educated man with multiple degrees. I think he had multiple masters even, who had traveled the world exploring different religious and spiritual traditions. He had studied Zen Buddhism. He was speaking about his experiences in college and how obnoxious he was to all his friends because he was so excited about Zen Buddhism and trying to get everyone really excited about it. And then also he was an initiate of Yoruba, speaking of Yoruba. And, so he had been to that area. He had been to Nigeria or to Yoruba land and had received teachings, received an initiation into Yoruba. And the whole time I was hearing him speak, he was talking about, first of all, I was kind of making mental note of like, wow, you probably come from a lot of money. Like, no judgment there, but you probably do. The fact that went to all these really prestigious schools and have multiple degrees from prestigious schools, and have also traveled the world to study with these different groups of people. Like, there's probably a lot of family money involved. Yeah, exactly. Like, and again, no judgment there, but just kind of noticing, okay, you're white, you're a guy, you probably have a lot of money, you've spent a lot of time in ivory tower situations surrounded by academia. So noticing this is where he's coming from, right? And he's speaking, I'm getting more and more pissed off because he's talking, just the feeling of it. He's all up here. He's all in his brain. And everything he's saying is intellectualized and really academic, and about the study of the lineages, and about like, this is the way that you have to do it. Again, really dogmatic and rigid in the way that he's communicating. And so I'm feeling there, I'm just getting more and more like, I'm hot, and I'm like, I have to take off my sweater because I'm like sweating from just how much I'm being kind of upset by this person who, it felt to me as though I was like, where is the heart behind what you're doing? Where is the communication with spirit behind what you're doing? Everything that he was sharing, somebody else had told him, or he had read somewhere, or somebody else had specifically taught him. It didn't feel as though he was sharing anything from personal experience, and it bugged me. So eventually, you know, kind of instigator that I am, I raise my hand during the question portion. He's taking questions from other people, and there I am, like, me, call on me. And so I ask him, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I asked him, where do you find, and I may have said something about, you know, I'm a spiritual mentor or whatever. And something I really encourage with my students is the intuitive investigation of your spiritual practice first, because that's you forming your direct relationship with spirit, your direct relationship with your ancestors, with these beings, these guides who want to come through you, and then following it up with the academic investigation, following it up with finding the teachers and finding the appropriate resources to honor that lineage and that tradition. And but first round, you know, have your own experience and then round it out. You know, just like I tell people who ask me, what's this crystal for? I say, ask the crystal, have the crystal tell you, and then come back and ask me, and then maybe go read about it later. But don't go straight to the book and read about it, because that's immediately cutting you off from that intuition, from that connection straight from source. So I asked him this question, where is that intersection of the intuitive and the academic pursuit of a spiritual practice? And he shut me down. I mean, of course, right? He shut me down he basically called me irresponsible for encouraging my students to have an intuitive exploration of their spiritual practice. And not in so many words, but implied accusing me of appropriating practices, and said that that's a really good way to be basically thieving from different traditions. And he would never dare, this is another thing he said, I would never dare to come in to call in the ancestors without being trained by somebody in Yoruba, for example. I'm going to do it exactly the way they taught me. This is another thing I forgot to mention to you, but he said, you know, since this is exactly what I was taught, I would never dare to improvise. He actually threw that word in there too. And so I'm sitting there just immediately like, wow, okay, good job. You know, like, you're an academic. I thought academics were supposed to be open-minded to people asking questions that challenge their viewpoint. You know, first of all, I was disappointed in him from that perspective of like, you just, you know, shut me down straight up. Second of all, his poor clients, the people who are working with him, who he's telling, like, I can pretty much guarantee the way he was treating the room, he was really specifically telling people, this is the way that you must do this thing. I'm a fan of, there are many paths to the top of the mountain. Like, the way that I might indicate to you, it has a lot of flexibility in there because you are a different being from me. And so I share this story in order to, this is related to the piece of advice that I want to offer. Do the intuitive investigation first, no matter what a certain academic scholar or any academic scholar or any academic religious theologian might tell you. Have your personal connection. That is important, that is vital, because that's the life force from which a spiritual practice is born. That is the most important thing, is your service to spirit. And of course, keeping in mind, you can always go back and investigate. And I highly encourage that too, as you know, the second part of this is like, have your intuitive investigation, have your awakening experience, then go read about it, go find the teachers, go ask the people. But the very first piece should be between you and spirit and nobody else. That's my big piece of advice.
Good. Thanks, Michelle. Love that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think just a really quick, simple, thing just to, honestly, a lot of this is just drawing awareness, right? Is just saying, interesting. What is my spiritual ancestry? What is my genetic ancestry? Where am I coming from? What maybe would like, sitting and asking what would like to be healed within my lineage? Who is showing up for me as my guides? And, be curious. It's a really allowing a curiosity, and once we start making that inquiry, then you'll have somebody show up in a dream, you'll have something happen, you'll have a book fall off the shelf at you, you'll have these things that come into your awareness, these synchronicities that start to happen just from making the inquiry around, okay, what is the work that needs to be done with my ancestors? What is this for me? Super simple.
Yeah. How about you? Any last piece of advice?
Just sort of an image of always being in conversation with other entities. For example, if I wanted to know about you, Michelle, I would not go to an online resource when you yourself can tell me who you are. So it's sort of like your advice of letting an intuitive moment happen is crucial. And for me, that's crucial because all of this is these are entities, called the invoking of an ancestor. The ancestor has a desire. The ancestor is not it's not a formula. You know what I mean? These things have a life force that we ought to be respectful of. And so I think playing around with the conversation image for me has been helpful, and recognizing that there are lots of different languages of how all of these worlds mash up together. And sometimes it's the language of intuition, sometimes it's the language of synchronicity, sometimes it's the language of a repeat refrain. I get a lot of the same few words said over and over again in different settings, and I'm like, okay, that's a message. And so just sort of maybe waking up one day and being like, I'm going to speak a different language today, and see what comes through, where you start to get the goosebumps and start to feel a pull, because I don't think it's complicated. I think it's quite simple. There's a conversation happening, and we can become aware of it. And so know that you can.
And it's easier than we think.
Yeah, thank God. Goddesses.
Give yourself permission.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
So beautiful. So do we have any ending words that anybody feels?
I don't know. I feel like we could keep talking for a while, but we may as well
keep talking for a while.
Keep going.
Yeah. Anything that Toni, anything that you're plugging? Anything that any way that I don't even know how it, if people work with you or things like that. Anything any talks you're giving, or any resources that you have for people that you wanted to share?
Unfortunately, I'm a baby in this walk of getting myself together in a way like this. I'm sort of just realizing what all of these awakenings mean for me as a worker in the world. So you can find me on Facebook. I'd be happy to stay in touch with folks. I'm more of a dialogical kind of person, so I would love to talk with people about anything that's come up in the chat thread, or that comes up in the future. And as I get myself together in more tangible ways, maybe I'll be back with you all or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Can we also, because who knows, who may be watching or listening, can we say that you're looking for a job?
I'm in the job search now. So I'd love to offer some medicine to that race and ethnic wound that exists here. I think that's a place where I can be very present. So I'm open to facilitating workshops about racial justice, anti-racism work. I am open to facilitating workshops about in this line of developing spiritual practices and finding an alignment with the way you're represented in the world as a person and how that matches your spiritual life. So if you have a community circle, a church circle, any kind of learning center, I'm happy to participate in facilitating in those ways. So
yeah,
call me up.
/ if you're putting on any, I can attest to what a wonderful speaker Toni is. And I mean, obviously her presence here, having heard her offer her talk at Embrace Festival. So I know there are some people watching and tuning in who are involved in not only hosting community-based gatherings, but also putting on larger gatherings for, for your clients, for your largely for your clients, or for if you're hosting retreats or festivals, or if you're hosting a conference even. Toni is a wonderful speaker and facilitator, and can speak at great length about all of these things that we've talked about today and so much more. So I would highly encourage you to stay in touch and reach out.
Thank you both for that. I don't ever think of that, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, we're we're on it. Michelle, do you have anything coming up?
I'm moving in 2 weeks, so that's where a lot of my attention is going right now. I do no.
Okay.
The women's conference.
Oh yeah, I'm speaking at a conference in October. Thank you. It's called the Superwoman Summit. I will be giving a keynote talk on Queens and Kings, the royal archetypes of the divine feminine and masculine. So if you would love to hear this talk, please contact me for a discount code, and I will get you a discount code for a ticket for the conference. It is a 3-day conference here in Portland, focused on women's empowerment and creating equality in the workplace and social justice in the feminine way. And I should say also, everybody on the gender spectrum is totally welcome. There will be men speaking at this conference as well, non-binary folk. Everybody is welcome to attend this conference. It's not for women only. Superwoman Summit.
So good.
Yeah. How about you, Kat?
I am just launching my Light Warrior Mentorship Program again, which is my 6-month group mentorship program, which is going to start in mid-October. And I am putting it out possibly today. I don't know, my website just went sideways. So I am hoping that I can get that fixed up and get it out today or tomorrow. But I am really excited to see who's going to be joining me and coming into that container, because it is a powerful, transformative process for healers and coaches and all those who guide to bring their work to the world and up-level their skills and everything that is needed for support for this next up-level in evolution and business and practice. So super excited. Thank you so much for joining us and being on the show. And we are the Shaman Sisters, and you can reach out to us at shamansistersessions@gmail.com or on our Facebook page, Shaman Sister Sessions. All of our prior episodes are on YouTube at the same name, Shaman Sister Sessions. We also have all of our prior episodes on iTunes and Stitcher. Those have just gone up. So if you would like to send us some love and support us, just going and rating us, amazing, and giving us a good review is very helpful.
Yeah, and subscribe to our iTunes channel, please, if you feel so called, because when we have more subscribers, we show up higher. And it is our great joy to offer this work to you. This is something that Kat and I love to do anyway, is just sit and chat, invite in other amazing people to sit and chat with us. So thank you for your continued participation in our Shaman Sister Sessions offering. If you feel called to donate to support us in this, we do have a donate button. That can be found on my website, joyofenergy.com, under the Shaman Sister Sessions page, if you'd like to offer us some financial support for this venture that we're doing. Other than that, if you feel called to work with Catherine or myself, or Kat and myself together, again, also please do feel free to reach out to Toni. She is available to connect with you on Facebook. Her link is in the event description, Toni Anne Reynolds. Thank you so much, Toni, for being here with us today. It's
Thank you both.
Such a joy to have you. Thank you. Yay. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.